Hello, glad to see you on the channel. Subscribe, leave a like, and don't forget to write a comment. Enjoy watching.
At my own housewarming dinner, my dad raised a glass and joked, loudly enough for everyone at the table to hear, "So when will you finally catch up to your sister?" My realtor didn't even blink. She slid the house deed onto the table, calm as a priest at a funeral, and said, "Actually, she'll be paying rent. I just finalized the sale with your daughter." My mom froze mid-bite. My sister's jaw clenched so tight, I thought her face might crack. And then, silence. That thick, heavy kind of silence that feels like it's judging you. But let me rewind just a bit. Because that moment didn't come out of nowhere. It was the result of years, no, decades, of being the one who always came second, even when I was first. Growing up in our house in Springfield, Illinois, there was a very clear hierarchy, and no one ever really tried to hide it. My younger sister Lena was born 3 years after me, and it was like she showed up with her own personal spotlight. From the moment she could talk, she knew how to charm a room. My mom used to say she could sell water to a fish, and my dad loved to say she was going to marry rich and save them all the trouble. It wasn't said with malice, but it was constant. And it added up. Lena got the new bike at 9, I got her hand-me-down. Lena had a sweet 16 party with a DJ and a rented venue. I got a backyard barbecue with 2 folding tables and a Safeway cake. Lena failed algebra, and Dad got her a tutor. I passed with an A, and no one even asked. I didn't mind it at first. Honestly, I didn't even notice it when I was a kid. I thought it was normal for older siblings to fly under the radar, while the younger ones got all the attention. But by the time we were in our 20s, it was impossible to ignore. Lena went to college out of state on my parents' dime, changed her major 3 times, graduated 6 years later, and still got them to co-sign her lease in a downtown high-rise apartment. Meanwhile, I worked 2 jobs to pay my tuition at a local university, graduated on time, and moved into a 1-bedroom apartment with a leaking faucet and a landlord who always forgot to send maintenance. Still, whenever we got together for holidays or birthdays, the conversation always came back to Lena, how well she was doing, how glamorous her job in PR sounded, how proud Mom was when she posted that photo with the mayor's campaign team. Never mind that I had been promoted twice in 2 years and was quietly saving more than both of them combined. I was reliable, quiet, low maintenance, as my mom liked to say, and maybe that's why no one ever looked close enough to notice what I was actually building. So when I finally bought a house, a real house, not a condo, not a townhouse, but a standalone 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and an actual fenced-in backyard, I didn't tell anyone, not at first, not because I was trying to hide it, but because I didn't want their input. I didn't want my mom saying the kitchen was too small or my dad suggesting I should have gone for a newer build. And I definitely didn't want Lena acting like she helped. I bought it with my own savings, with a realtor I found through work, and I made every decision without asking a single soul for permission. That part was sacred. I invited everyone over under the pretense of a small housewarming dinner. I didn't send out fancy invitations or create a group chat. I just called them individually, Mom, Dad, Lena, and told them the new address. Said I'd love for them to see the place, nothing too formal. They didn't ask too many questions. Why would they? In their minds, I was probably renting. That's what they were used to. That's what I'd always done. The day of the dinner, I woke up early, couldn't sleep. My nerves were shot, not because I was worried about the food or the house being clean, but because I knew what this night represented. It was the first time I'd invited them into something that was entirely mine. Something they hadn't touched, contributed to, or influenced, and I wasn't sure how they were going to take it. I cleaned the whole place top to bottom, polished the hardwood floors until they looked like glass, and even baked my dad's favorite peach cobbler from scratch, just to soften the blow a little. I had no illusions that it would stop the comments, but at least it might take the edge off. Lena showed up early, of course. She always did that, liked to come in and help, so she could take credit later. She waltzed in with a bottle of wine tucked under one arm, and her new boyfriend, some doctor or lawyer or maybe both, I didn't really catch his name, trailing behind her. She glanced around the living room, did that thing where she smiles but her eyes are scanning for flaws, and said, "Oh wow, it's cute." Very traditional, which is code for not sleek, not modern, not up to her standards. I just smiled and thanked her, then handed her a dish towel and asked her to help with the salad. It didn't take long for the rest to show up. My mom walked in with a tub of potato salad and a scented candle. My dad immediately turned on the TV to see if he could catch the end of the game, and just like that, it felt like we were back in the family living room, except now it was mine, and I had to remind myself that I didn't need to shrink into the background this time. I poured wine, passed around appetizers, made small talk. Janice, my realtor, was there too, sitting quietly on the armchair with a glass of Merlot, letting the chaos unfold. I'd invited her partly because she'd been instrumental in helping me through the entire home buying process, but also because I needed one person in the room who knew the full truth. She didn't say much, she just watched. As we sat down to dinner, Lena leaned over and casually asked, "So, did you and Dad end up splitting the cost of the house, or did he spot you the down payment too?" She said it like a joke, with that syrupy tone she uses when she wants to sound innocent. But there was venom in it. That same old assumption that I couldn't possibly have done this without help. I smiled, took a sip of my wine, and said, "Nope, paid every penny myself." She blinked, clearly surprised, but didn't push. That was the moment I knew she had no idea what was coming. None of them did. And for once, I didn't feel nervous about it. I felt ready because the next few hours were going to change everything. If there's one thing I've learned the hard way, it's that the quiet work, the work you do when no one is looking, when no one believes in you, when everyone assumes you'll just keep coasting in the same safe, invisible lane you've always lived in, ends up becoming the most powerful thing you have. And the truth is, I didn't tell anyone in my family I was buying a house because I knew exactly what they'd do with that information, how they'd twist it, question it, downplay it, and ultimately use it to wedge in their opinions and criticisms before I even signed the papers. So instead of offering them front row seats to yet another event in my life they could belittle, I built my plan in silence, brick by brick, decision by decision, far away from the suffocating weight of their expectations. It started, like most things do, with a breaking point. I'd been renting a second-floor apartment in a converted Victorian on the edge of town for almost 4 years. And while I liked the charm of the creaky floors and the way the morning light came through the bay window in my bedroom, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still stuck in a version of myself I had long since outgrown. I was paying well over market rate to live in someone else's crumbling nostalgia, while Lena was swanning around in her sleek minimalist condo with her industrial lighting and custom marble backsplash. And every time my parents came to visit me, they acted like they were stepping into some sort of low-budget student housing situation that required their pity. I remember my dad once joking that if the rent went up any higher, I should just move back home until I figured things out. Like I was still 23, like I hadn't been working full-time and managing my life on my own since I was barely legal to drink. So one Sunday afternoon, after scraping mold off my bathroom ceiling for what felt like the third time that year, I sat down with a notepad and started writing out numbers. Not dreams, not hopes, just numbers. What I made, what I spent, what I had in savings, what I could realistically afford. I didn't fantasize about crown molding or walk-in closets. I looked at the math and made it work. I had been putting money away steadily for over 5 years, partly because I'm naturally cautious and partly because I'd gotten used to having no one to fall back on. No bailout fund, no emergency parental wire transfer. Just me, my paychecks, and a steadily growing savings account I didn't touch except for real emergencies. Add to that a small but smart move I made during the early pandemic. I'd invested in a green energy ETF that, somehow, exploded in value over 2 years. And suddenly, I wasn't just a woman who dreamed of owning a house. I was a woman who could do it. Still, I didn't jump into it. I spent 6 months researching. I went to open houses on weekends and used fake names when I signed the visitor sheets. I downloaded every home buying checklist I could find online and devoured real estate podcasts during my commutes. Eventually, a coworker named Nadia introduced me to her aunt, Janice, who had been in the real estate game for over 20 years and had the kind of no-nonsense energy that made me feel safe instantly. Janice didn't sugarcoat anything. She looked at my budget, told me I was in better shape than most people walking into banks these days, and promised me she wouldn't waste my time showing me granite countertops I couldn't afford. We looked at 7 houses in total. I fell in love with the 5th one, a white 2-story home with deep green shutters and a red front door that made me think of all the things I never dared to picture for myself. It had a backyard, a real fireplace, and enough quirks to feel lived in but not worn down. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was mine. Or at least it would be, if everything went through. The buying process was a blur of inspections, signatures, and late-night Google searches. Every time I doubted myself, every time I wondered if I should ask my dad what he thought about the interest rate, or whether Mom would have preferred a bigger kitchen, I reminded myself that the entire point of this was to not ask them. I had spent a lifetime being told I was too sensitive, too cautious, too slow to leap, while Lena jumped headfirst into everything with the reckless confidence of someone who'd never known consequences. This house wasn't just about owning property. It was about claiming space, mental, emotional, and literal, that had never fully belonged to me. The day I closed on the house, I sat in Janice's office, holding a pen that felt heavier than it should, staring down at the final document with a kind of quiet disbelief. Janice watched me like she knew what I was feeling before I said it. She didn't congratulate me with some fake chipper smile. She just nodded and said, "Feels different when no one hands it to you, huh?" And I nodded back, unable to find the words for the kind of pride that swelled in my chest like something sacred. I didn't move in right away. I took 2 weeks to paint the living room and swap out the old brass fixtures in the bathroom. I made small changes, nothing drastic, just enough to make it feel like mine. I kept telling myself I had time to tell the family, but every time I picked up the phone, I could hear my dad's voice in my head, asking if I was sure I hadn't overpaid, or my mom wondering aloud if the neighborhood was the right fit for a single woman. And Lena, she'd just smile that smile and say, "Good for you," like she was handing out praise to a child who finally tied her shoes. So I didn't tell them. I kept it to myself. I planned a simple dinner, one that wouldn't raise suspicion. Something casual enough that they'd walk in expecting the usual rented space with off-white walls and a sagging couch. I cleaned, I cooked. I made it look effortless, but I didn't forget what Lena said when she walked in. "So, did you and Dad end up splitting the cost of the house, or did he spot you the down payment too?" It wasn't a question, it was an assumption. A belief so deeply baked into her understanding of who I was that she couldn't imagine a version of this, where I was the one who made it happen on my own. That's when I knew this wasn't just going to be a dinner. This was going to be the moment everything shifted. The moment the story they'd always told themselves about me, the background character in Lena's Golden Parade, would fall apart right in front of them. And I had no intention of softening the blow. There's something uniquely exhausting about hosting your own family, especially when you know, deep in your gut, that every bite of food, every sip of wine, every single decorative choice you made will be silently, and sometimes not so silently, judged against a standard you never agreed to in the first place, a benchmark you were never even consulted about, because the measuring stick was built around someone else entirely, and your only role in the whole production was to fall slightly short of it every single time, no matter how high you actually climbed. So as I set the table that evening, laying out the cloth napkins I'd ironed the night before, lighting the candles I picked up from that boutique near the farmer's market. Yes, the ones that cost way too much, but smelled like calm and competence. I could feel the anticipation thickening the air like a storm gathering at the edge of the horizon. Not loud or violent yet, but undeniably present and inching closer with every tick of the clock. I had been careful, meticulous even, in my planning, not because I wanted to impress them, but because I needed every detail to say what I was too tired of repeating out loud, that I had built this life with my own two hands, that nothing in this house was gifted, co-signed, inherited, or handed down with strings attached, and that every square foot, from the perfectly patched roof to the slightly uneven front steps, bore the weight of decisions I had made quietly, competently, and completely alone. I cooked everything from scratch: rosemary chicken with lemon butter, roasted vegetables with a drizzle of balsamic, a salad with homemade vinaigrette, and of course, the peach cobbler my dad loved more than anything else I've ever served him, which I deliberately placed at the far end of the counter so he'd have to ask for it. Just once, instead of expecting it to appear in front of him like it always had. They arrived in their usual staggered, chaotic way. Lena and her boyfriend first, early again, and just slightly too polished for what was supposed to be a casual family dinner, both of them dressed like they were stopping by before heading to a gallery opening or a political fundraiser, with Lena in some kind of expensive-looking wrap dress, and her new boyfriend, Marcus or Mark or whatever, wearing a navy blazer over a black t-shirt, like he just walked out of an article in GQ. She handed me a bottle of wine, French of course, and made a point of saying, "It pairs better with seafood," but I figured it was a safe bet. Her eyes flitting briefly over the chicken roasting in the oven, already signaling that she didn't expect much. I smiled, thanked her, and placed it on the counter without a second glance, already regretting the idea of letting them through the door first. My parents came next, Mom carrying her go-to contribution, a bowl of potato salad she insisted was just something simple, though she always managed to mention, usually more than once, that her co-workers asked her for the recipe at every potluck. Dad came in talking about traffic, then immediately wandered into the living room to inspect my television setup, making a comment about the modest screen, with the kind of chuckle that people use when they're pretending not to be critical, but are, in fact, deeply unimpressed. I offered drinks, gave them the tour, brief, efficient, free of unnecessary explanations, and tried to keep my voice steady as we moved from room to room, pointing out the details I knew they'd either overlook or quietly downgrade in their minds, like the refinished wood floors, original from the 60s, or the crown molding I installed with the help of a contractor I found through a community Facebook group, a detail I deliberately left out because I already knew it wouldn't make the cut in their mental catalog of impressive accomplishments. Dinner was served around 7, and by then, the house was warm, the wine was flowing, and the unspoken tension had settled like a heavy velvet curtain across the entire evening, thick and theatrical, waiting for its cue. We sat around the table, the plates full, the lighting on, and for a moment, I almost believed we might get through it. My mom complimented the food with a distracted, "This chicken's nice," which is as close to glowing praise as I've ever gotten from her. And my dad, after 3 full bites of cobbler, finally said, "You remembered the nutmeg this time," like it was some kind of secret test I'd finally passed after years of being just a fraction off. Lena, for her part, remained poised and perfectly condescending, asking questions that weren't really questions like, "How are you finding the maintenance? And did you go through a broker or just directly with the seller?" Which translated roughly to, "Are you sure you're capable of handling this on your own?" Marcus, or was it Mitchell, chimed in only occasionally, making generic comments about the housing market, clearly trying to sound supportive while towing the line of neutrality, like he hadn't been fully briefed on which side of the sister war he was supposed to be on. It was my dad, though, who finally delivered the line that turned the whole evening. We were halfway through dessert, coffee cups half full, the lull of post-meal silence just beginning to set in, when he leaned back in his chair, glanced around the room with that slightly smug expression he wore when he wanted everyone to know he was about to make a joke at someone's expense, and said, "So, when will you finally catch up to your sister?" It wasn't cruel, not in tone, not exactly, but it didn't need to be. It was sharp in its casualness, slicing through the table like a knife through warm pie, and I felt the air go still, like the whole house was waiting to see if I'd laugh or cry. And then Janice, who had been sitting quietly at the edge of the room, patient, polite, and observant in that way only seasoned professionals can be, put down her wine glass, reached into her leather portfolio, and without raising her voice or changing her expression, slid a thin stack of papers across the table toward my father. The deed, with my name on it, clear, bold, official. She didn't smile. She just said, actually, she won't be catching up. Her sister will be paying rent. I just finalized the sale with your daughter. There was a moment, no more than a heartbeat, where no one moved, no one spoke, and the only sound was the faint ticking of the clock above the fireplace, the same one I'd hung the night before, knowing that this exact moment was coming. Then came the silence, the kind that doesn't just fill the room, but owns it, the kind that makes forks pause midair and sends eyes darting around the table, searching for someone to say something, anything that might make sense of what they just heard. My mother blinked rapidly, clearly trying to process how this could possibly be true without her having known first. My father stared at the papers like they were written in another language, unable to comprehend the idea that I could have done this without his approval or even his awareness. And Lena looked like someone had just tipped over her entire sense of reality, her mouth slightly open, eyes narrowing, lips curling into that familiar sneer she used whenever she felt threatened but didn't want to appear rattled. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. Everything I could have said had already been etched into those papers, into the bricks and beams of the house they were sitting in, into the careful choices I had made in silence over the past year. I just took a sip of my coffee, leaned back in my chair, and waited. Because this dinner, which had started as another performance of old roles and tired scripts, had finally shifted into something new, and none of them were ready for it. There's a particular kind of silence that doesn't settle gently or pass like a breeze, but instead digs itself into the corners of a room, expands in your chest, and demands attention like an unwanted guest refusing to leave. And that's exactly what filled my dining room in the seconds that followed Janice's perfectly timed statement. A silence so heavy it felt almost tangible, like you could reach out and touch it, press your hand against it and feel the resistance of people trying to pretend they weren't reeling from what had just been said. My mother's hand, still resting on her fork, seemed frozen mid-motion, her eyes locked on the document now sitting on the table like it had always belonged there, though I knew, based on how tightly her jaw clenched and the thin line her lips formed, that she was scrambling to understand how she had been left out of something this significant. How she, the mother, hadn't known, hadn't been consulted, hadn't even heard a whisper about her eldest child buying a house. My father, always the loudest in any room and perpetually confident in the belief that no major decision in the family could possibly happen without his input, stared down at the paperwork as if it were a riddle he hadn't been given enough time to solve. His brow furrowed in that very specific way that always preceded a dismissive laugh. But this time there was no laugh, no recovery line, no joke to smooth over what had so clearly been a checkmate. He opened his mouth once, then closed it, his eyes scanning for an ally, someone to share in his confusion, someone to affirm that this couldn't possibly be true, that maybe there was a mistake, a misunderstanding. But all he found were stunned faces and the slow-burning realization that he no longer held the upper hand in a conversation he hadn't even realized he was losing. Lena, predictably, was the first to react with anything more than stunned silence, and true to form, she leaned into that insufferable blend of wounded pride and performative disbelief, the one she'd mastered in adolescence and weaponized into adulthood, and said, in a voice louder than necessary and dripping with condescension masked as confusion, Wait, you bought this place? Like completely? As in, your name is on the deed?" As though the very idea was so far outside her mental framework that she had to repeat it out loud just to believe it. I didn't flinch, I didn't smile, I didn't gloat. I simply nodded, calm and deliberate, because I had rehearsed this moment so many times in my head that it no longer felt like a surprise, only a conclusion. "Yes," I said, my voice steady, my words paced and clear. "I bought it last month. I've been saving for years. I worked with Janice. I handled everything myself." And then I added, without blinking, without raising my voice or trying to soften the impact. And I offered the upstairs suite to a tenant beginning next month. She needed a temporary place after her lease ended, and this house has more than enough space. I paused just long enough for Lena to connect the dots, which she did slowly, painfully, the horror blooming across her face in stages. You, she said, almost choking on the word, you offered me a room? As a tenant? I nodded again. With a lease and everything, I figured it might work for a few months while you figure out your next move. If looks could kill, mine would have been the shortest housewarming dinner in history, because the glare Lena gave me could have burned straight through the floor. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood with a sound that practically screamed indignation, and let out a disbelieving laugh that felt too forced to be natural. You're kidding, right? This is a joke. It has to be. You think I'm going to pay you rent? Live in your house? After you deliberately kept this from all of us, and then dropped it on us like some kind of twisted gotcha moment? Wow. Just wow. She looked around the room for support, but none came, because my parents were still too stunned to speak, too unsure of what to say now that the reality had been laid bare and their carefully curated hierarchy had been turned inside out. Marcus, or whatever his name was, stood as well, clearly sensing the awkwardness had escalated to a level he was not emotionally equipped to navigate, and offered Lena a gentle hand on the shoulder, which she brushed off, storming toward the entryway in heels that clicked like gunshots against the wood. I didn't stop her. I didn't apologize. I didn't chase after her with reassurances or clarifications, because there was nothing to explain. The truth was the truth, and I was done wrapping it in soft padding just to make it easier for people who had spent years dismissing me to digest. My father finally broke the silence after she left, running a hand over his face like he was trying to wipe away the last 10 minutes, and said, I don't understand why you wouldn't tell us, why you do all of this in secret. It wasn't angry, not yet. It was hurt, confused, hollow. I looked at him, not with spite, but with a tired honesty that had been sitting on my chest for years, and said, because every time I've done something on my own, you've treated it like a fluke. Every time I've made a decision without consulting you or Mom, it's been met with skepticism or condescension. I wanted one thing, just one, that belonged to me without your fingerprints on it. He didn't reply, and maybe that was for the best. My mother, still quiet, still piecing everything together, finally said, in a tone I hadn't heard from her since I was a teenager, you could have at least let us celebrate it with you. And that part almost got to me, because maybe there was a version of the story where they did support me, where they were genuinely proud, where they helped me unpack boxes and bring over a housewarming plant. And maybe there was a sliver of guilt buried somewhere beneath my pride. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I nodded slowly and said, celebration comes after recognition. I just needed you to recognize it first. That night, after the plates were cleared and the remaining conversation stumbled through awkward silences and half-hearted attempts at normalcy, I stood at the window and watched as their cars pulled away, headlights fading down the street, the night returning to the quiet I had chosen for myself. My phone buzzed around midnight, a voicemail from Lena, her voice sharp and cold, layered with rage and humiliation, saying, you think this is over? You've embarrassed me. Don't forget who they'll always believe. I listened to it once, then deleted it. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that her belief in her superiority had always been just that. A belief, one that crumbled the moment she was faced with proof that I had not only caught up, but had done so without her even noticing. And as I turned off the lights and walked up the stairs in my house, I realized this wasn't just fallout. This was a shift, an irreversible one. And whatever came next, I was ready. There's something profoundly satisfying, almost spiritual in a way, about watching a long game plan unfold exactly the way you imagined it, especially when that plan was born. Not from anger or pettiness, or some dramatic urge to get even, but from the kind of deep, bone-level exhaustion that only comes from spending most of your adult life being underestimated by the very people who claim to know you best. People who've decided your role in the family narrative long ago and never once paused to consider that maybe, just maybe, you were capable of rewriting your own script. I hadn't set out to humiliate my sister at my housewarming dinner, and despite what she and my parents might believe now, I hadn't done it out of spite. What I had done was spend years carefully, intentionally building a life she would never see coming, because she never thought she had to look. After Lena's dramatic exit and the chilly, wordless way my parents left later that evening, I didn't sleep. Not because I was stressed or anxious or second-guessing what I had done, but because my brain was wired from the sheer emotional magnitude of what had happened. It was like a weight had shifted, as if all the pressure of being the responsible one, the quiet one, the one who always just takes what she's given, had finally cracked. And beneath it was something solid, something wara, something mine. I stayed up drinking tea at the kitchen table, the room still smelling faintly of roasted rosemary chicken and burnt sugar, and thought about how quietly this revenge had brewed, how carefully I'd let it simmer under years of polite smiles, swallowed insults, and 1,000 tiny cuts disguised as family jokes. The plan hadn't started with a desire to put Lena in her place. In truth, it began the moment I realized she was going to fall. Maybe not hard, but definitely in a way she hadn't anticipated. And that, for once, I could choose whether to offer her a hand or watch her land exactly where she'd thrown so many others before me. I'd found out entirely by accident about her lease expiring when we bumped into each other at a wine bar near my old apartment a few months prior. She was there with one of her many rotating friend groups, loud and magnetic as always, and I was there meeting Janice after a viewing. She didn't notice me at first, but once she did, she came over, arms outstretched in that exaggerated way she does when she wants to look warmer than she feels, and talked for 10 full minutes without taking a breath, updating me on her new boyfriend, her maybe promotion, and how she was shopping around for new living spaces because her condo lease was up at the end of summer. She said it casually, offhanded, like someone who didn't worry about logistics or deadlines because, in her world, something always fell into place at the last second, usually thanks to someone else. I smiled, nodded, asked polite questions, and said nothing about the 3-bedroom house I had already put an offer on. That was the moment the seed planted itself, not of revenge, but of opportunity. A soft voice inside me whispered that this could be it, the opening I never had before, the rare moment where the circumstances of her life and mine aligned in just the right way that, with a little precision, I could finally flip the story. And so I waited. I closed on the house. I timed the housewarming dinner perfectly. I made sure the guest suite was ready, neutral colors, its own entrance, private bath, and when Lena began circling back weeks later with a strangely humble tone, dropping hints about how hard the market had become, and how maybe crashing with family wouldn't be the worst thing temporarily, I played dumb at first, then offered the room as if I were doing her a favor. I drafted a lease agreement, one that included all the right legal protections, but still sounded casual enough to make her feel like she was in control. And when she hesitated, because of course she did, her pride was always her weakest limb, I reminded her gently that the offer wouldn't be open forever. 2 weeks after the dinner, Lena moved into my house, not into my guest room, into my property, under my roof, on my terms. And while she didn't look me in the eye as she carried her designer duffel bags up the stairs, I could see it on her face. That flicker of realization, that uncomfortable dawning truth that she had no idea how she ended up here, living not just with but beneath the sister she'd spent her whole life quietly looking down on. It was poetic, not because it was grand or theatrical, but because it was so mundane, so bureaucratic, just paperwork and patience, signatures and silence. Our arrangement was polite but cold. She paid her rent on time, as per the lease. We shared little beyond occasional greetings and the sound of footsteps echoing through the hallways at night. I didn't lord it over her. I didn't bring it up. I didn't need to. The space itself did the talking. Every corner of the house reminded her where she stood, not because I said it, but because she was literally living it. My parents visited a few weeks later, under the pretense of checking in, but I knew they wanted to see for themselves what this new world looked like now that their golden daughter was the tenant and the quiet one had become the landlord. My mother's face when she saw Lena emerge from the side entrance, keys in hand, hair tied back, no entourage, no performance, was something I will never forget. She tried to act casual, but her confusion betrayed her. My father, who had called me once since the dinner, but hadn't said anything meaningful beyond a mumbled, "Hope everything's going okay," looked around the house with a different kind of quiet, one that carried the weight of a man realizing he might have backed the wrong horse. I gave them coffee. I gave them time. I gave them the chance to ask questions, to dig for some explanation that would make them feel better about the fact that they had never seen me coming. But I offered nothing except hospitality, because I had nothing to prove anymore. The funny thing is, after all of it, after the lease, after the voicemails from Lena, after the dozens of awkward shared dinners in that house, I don't think she ever actually apologized. Not once. She never admitted she was wrong, never acknowledged how many years she'd spent playing queen in a court that had propped her up at my expense, but she stayed. She paid her rent. And every single month when that check arrived in my account, it felt like a small, quiet form of justice. The last time I saw her before she moved out, just a few weeks ago, she left the keys on the counter and said, with that same tight-lipped smile she always wore when she wanted to appear unaffected, "Thanks for the place. It worked out better than I expected." I just nodded and said, "Glad I could help." Because by then, I had already won. Now when I sit on the porch with my coffee in the morning or walk through the kitchen and run my hand along the countertops, I picked out myself. I don't think about Lena or my parents as much as you'd expect. I think about how long I let their version of me shape my choices, and how quietly powerful it felt to step outside of that role and become something entirely unexpected. I didn't ruin her. I didn't humiliate anyone. I just waited. I worked. I signed the paperwork. And when the time came, I opened the door, not out of malice, but out of clarity. Sometimes revenge doesn't look like fire and fury. Sometimes it looks like handing your sister a lease agreement and charging her market rate. And that, I found, is more than enough.